Well, the big regulation, the so-called three red lines that was put forward late last year to control leverage by property developers, and then some associated regulations to control mortgage lending on behalf of banks, those certainly seem like enough to control leverage in this sector. The question has been how aggressively they're going to be enforced and how, in the case of Evergrande specifically, any spillover effects might be mitigated. As of right now, the stresses are in terms of raising capital for those in the property sector, borrowing becoming more expensive and challenging, and concerns around home buyers. Will they get properties that they may have prepaid for? Will suppliers be paid and so forth? So those spillover effects are really the concern from a macroeconomic perspective at this point.
Right.
And we
and
don't
what
anticipate
about
much tighter
Sure.
regulation. Yeah.
You don't anticipate much tighter regulation. And what about more skeletons tumbling out of the closet? Because I know Evergrande is obviously one of the larger developers, right? And so there's a lot of noise around what's happening with its liquidity situation. But it trickles down, right, top down, to some of the smaller players, some of the mid-sized players. And I wonder, when do we start hearing more about the sector facing trouble as a whole?
Well, certainly already the borrowing costs for many of these developers are higher, and that can impact their ability to continue purchasing land and developing projects. And that's in large part the intention, is to slow the pace of growth and construction in this sector, reduce the price premium for land, and make housing affordable for the broader mass of the population, to keep prices, in our view, somewhat flattish and avoid a persistent upward trend in prices for housing. So that's really a key focus. And so far it appears, if anything, the implementation of these debt curbs is having a bigger impact than expected. And again, the question being, how will the government limit any spillovers and perhaps moderate the pace of this deleveraging that's occurring?
Philosophically, almost for a moment, Andrew, we can almost not guess how this restructuring is going to go, because have we ever seen one like this, a restructuring of this magnitude? But then at the same time, the people behind the restructuring, Beijing, surely there's no one with more financial might and power to be able to do this properly.
We've certainly seen restructuring for other financial entities and conglomerates over the last couple of years, but the scale of this is much larger, 800 some property projects across the country. So that's really creating a large degree of the uncertainty about how that might take place, what entities might be involved, and again, how the spillovers from that might be mitigated. Clearly, the risks for growth as we look in the second half of this year, we're finishing up the third quarter. Growth is going to be very weak in the third quarter. We're estimating just over 1% at an annual rate from Q2 to Q3. If anything, risk to that probably to the downside. And so as we get into Q4 and start to go into 2022, we continue to think that we're going to need more policy support from the authorities in other areas, easing fiscal policy in particular, to help to support the broader economy amid these downside pressures and growth, which are really go beyond the property sector. We've had various small COVID outbreaks, more recently a crisis with regard to power cuts in some provinces that is limiting production, a broadly tight macro policy stance, and tighter regulation across a number of sectors. So there really a huge range of negative pressures on growth, and we think that macro policy will have to become more supportive in coming months to mitigate those, at least in part.